In this lesson, we're not going to create any new tests. Instead, let's focus on base select component test and see what we can improve in here. And the first thing is that every time we need to render the component, we have to repeat the same code in all of these tests. So I prefer to extract this piece of logic, which renders the component, into a separate function. So let's create the new function in here called mountSelect and paste the code to render the component. And we're gonna return the result of the rendering from this function. Let's also add a couple parameters in this function, such as mount options, which will be an empty object by default. And the second parameter will be shallow, which will be boolean. That is going to be used to specify how to render the component, whether to use shallow mount strategy or normal mount strategy. And then let's pass down all the options of this mount options object further as a props. In case any of these properties will not exist, we're gonna fall back to default values, like so. And by the way, we can also use mount function to render component by using shallow strategy by specifying additional option in this object called shallow. So we're gonna forward our shallow parameter and assign it to this option. Next, to avoid all these TypeScript errors, I'm going to declare new type up here with the name mount options. That is gonna be an object with properties options. There will be an array of objects of select option type. This is a custom type declared inside types.ts module, which has two properties, value and the label. And the second option in this type will be placeholder option, which is gonna be optional of string type. And after we're gonna specify that mount options will be object of mount options type, those TypeScript errors should be fixed. So now let's go over all our testing scenarios, and whenever we were using mount function to render the component, now we can use our custom function mountSelect, and this way we will drastically reduce amount of code in our tests. So in this first case, we're calling mountSelect function. As the first parameter, we're passing an empty mount options object, and as the second one, we're specifying that this component has to be rendered by using shallow strategy. In the next test, we have to pass placeholder option. So in this case, we're gonna pass an object with only one property placeholder as the first parameter. The next scenario will be pretty similar, but in here, instead of passing placeholder option, we have to pass an array of options under the options key, like this. Moving on to the next scenario. In this case, we don't need to override any options, so we're gonna pass an empty object. And finally, in the last test, we'll call mountSelect function without specifying any arguments, because in this case we have to render base select component by using normal strategy, not a shallow. And looks like I have made a mistake in one of the tests, specifically in the first testing scenario, where I have used shallow strategy to render the component, but in fact, this component has to be rendered by using normal strategy, so I'm not gonna pass true as the second argument, which allows us not to pass any arguments at all, because an empty options object is used by default as the first parameter. And now all tests are passing. And before finishing this lesson, I would like to introduce another utility function to render components by using shallow strategy. Instead of passing true every time, we have to render component by using shallow strategy, which at the same time is going to allow us not to specify the first parameter, an empty object, just to be able to pass second argument. So let's create new function with the name shallow mountSelect, right above mountSelect function. This function is also going to take mount options object, and all it will do is that it will delegate all the work to mountSelect function. In here I'm gonna forward these options as the first parameter, and just because in here we have to apply shallow rendering, we're gonna specify it true as the second parameter to mountSelect function. So now that we have this function, let's go over all the tests again. And in those places where we have to pass true as the second argument to mount select function, we're gonna replace this function call with shallow mount select function call without having to pass true as the second argument. And in this testing scenario, we don't even have to pass an empty object as the first parameter, because as I have said before, an empty object is used as a default value for this first parameter. And that's about it, all tests are still passing. Now let's consider another quick refactoring, which is inlining variable. In here, we are assigning the result of shallow mount select function to the wrapper constant, which is used only once. So why don't we align this call like this? And then we can remove this wrapper constant. And at the end, let's run all tests in the project to make sure that they are all green. Everything is passing.